Hey guys, tonight we slip down into the places most travelers in Japan never see, the hushed and shadowy world beneath Tokyo, where the scars of a war still lie hidden. You picture yourself standing on a bustling street, neon signs blinking, trains screeching overhead, vending machines humming, but then you find a rust-stained metal door wedged between two office blocks. It doesn't look like much, maybe a utility closet, but when you pull it open, the breath of cool, stale air rushes out, and suddenly, the city's chatter fades away. You're stepping into a tunnel, and in here, the walls themselves feel heavy with secrets. You probably won't survive this journey if you're claustrophobic, but hey, that's the price of curiosity, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The concrete corridor stretches ahead, reinforced with thick beams, the floor still sticky with decades of damp. You drag your fingertips along rough walls and feel carved grooves, emergency notches to anchor wires and pipes. These tunnels weren't meant for tourists. They were meant for survival. During the 1940s, Tokyo wasn't just a glittering capital, it was a target. Allied bombers rained fire down until the city seemed like a map of glowing embers. In that chaos, the Japanese government built and extended bunkers under the city like arteries, hoping officials could continue running the empire even as the streets above turned to ash. One mainstream fact that still stands out is the construction beneath the Ministry of Finance, an underground complex of meeting rooms and storage spaces meant to ensure the bureaucracy kept ticking through air raids. Historians still argue whether Tokyo's web of tunnels was truly extensive enough to function as a shadow city, or if much of it was a patchwork of disconnected shelters. The truth? Some areas remain sealed, leaving the debate deliciously unresolved. As you shuffle deeper, your shoes splash through shallow puddles, the water reflecting rusted Japanese characters painted on the walls. You wonder if they once marked evacuation routes, or perhaps just warned no smoking. Imagine being down here in the 1940s, the ceiling shaking from bombs overhead, dust sifting down on your hair, and the stale air growing thin. If you were a government clerk, you'd probably be clutching your briefcase, wondering if the whole world above had just ended while you scribbled another report on rice distribution.
And here's a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that after the war, kids would sneak into these abandoned tunnels to dare each other into walking alone, just to see who would be brave enough to face the dark. Locals whispered that ghosts of bomb victims still wandered these passages, tugging at sleeves in the dark. Ghost story or not, the stale odor of mold and history does make your imagination run wild. You stop by a side chamber where the wall bulges into a small reinforced alcove. It feels oddly shaped, almost like a half-finished office. Could it have been a communications room? A food stockpile? The dim beams from your flashlight reveal what looks like an old fuse box. The switch is corroded with green. It's the kind of object that makes you realize someone, decades ago, flipped that switch while sweat dripped from their forehead, maybe hoping it would keep lights glowing just a little longer. You keep moving, tracing the tunnels like veins through the body of the city. Every few steps, you find bricked-up doors, sealed with cement, like scars hiding something deeper. What's behind them? No one's certain. Historians still argue whether the Imperial Household Agency has maps that show larger bunkers connected to these systems. But those documents remain classified, and maybe they always will. After all, the idea that Tokyo could be riddled with secret halls leading straight toward the Imperial Palace is exactly the kind of mystery governments prefer not to confirm. The funny thing is, as much as the Japanese try to conceal these bunkers, modern subway construction sometimes stumbles right into them. There's an irony in commuters today unknowingly brushing past wartime walls while scrolling through TikTok. Imagine someone sipping a matcha latte, unaware they're 30 feet above a room once intended to save cabinet ministers from annihilation. History isn't just in museums, it's literally underfoot. At one bend in the corridor, your light reveals chalk marks still faintly visible, circles and arrows. Maybe they were drawn by engineers, or maybe by a young soldier bored on watch duty. If you lean close, you can see where fingernails scratched at the damp plaster. That tiny human touch cuts through the heaviness of history. People who crouched here weren't faceless wartime personnel. They were just people, probably terrified, probably missing their families. probably wishing they were anywhere else. The air grows cooler as you push farther in. You wonder how deep you are now. The truth is, Tokyo's tunnels are a patchwork of layers, some documented, many not. During reconstruction after the war, much of this underground world was simply sealed and forgotten. But it lingers in rumors, in unexplained blueprints, and in late-night urban explorer blogs that hint at restricted access doors behind subway stations. Historians still argue whether the government quietly maintains some of these routes as emergency shelters even today. If they do, you wouldn't be surprised. Finally, you find yourself standing in a cavernous chamber, the largest yet. The ceiling soars just high enough that your light doesn't quite reach the top. The echoes of your breath bounce around like whispers. It feels like a meeting room, or maybe a command post. For a moment, you stand silently, imagining rows of officials seated on folding chairs, the drone of a radio in the background, while above, Tokyo burned. It's eerie. It's sobering. And if you're honest, it's just a little thrilling. Because beneath this hyper-modern city, people still live their daily lives never suspecting the sleeping war rooms below. And you, for tonight, are the one who got to walk where the walls still hold their secrets.
You edge closer to the heart of Tokyo, where the streets throb with the beat of modern life, but your steps take you inward, toward the Imperial Palace. Above ground, tourists snap photos of moats and stone bridges, but you slip through a guarded gate in your imagination, passing beneath the elegant surface in the chambers few ever see. Down here, the concrete smells faintly of earth and rust, and the air is heavy, as though weighed down by centuries of secrecy. These are the rumored bunkers beneath the palace itself, the reinforced shelters built not just for officials, but for the emperor. You brush your hand along walls thicker than a bank vault, slabs of concrete poured to withstand the shock waves of American bombs. One mainstream fact is certain. The Imperial Palace grounds were fortified with air raid shelters by the early 1940s. The emperor's life was considered sacred, the linchpin of national unity, so ensuring his survival became a construction priority. Historians still argue whether the underground complexes here were elaborate command centers or simply hardened panic rooms with enough supplies for a few critical days. What's undeniable is the sheer effort invested, thousands of workers carving safety under the feet of tradition. Your footsteps echo into a chamber shaped like a narrow corridor. Imagine guards once posted here, their rifles slung and nerves stretched hot, listening for the low hum of bombers above. It's strange to picture, the most serene spot in Tokyo, a garden oasis hiding a heart of reinforced steel and fear. Quirky tidbit: according to some tales whispered by palace staff after the war, an underground passage may have linked parts of the palace to nearby subway lines, a kind of discreet exit strategy for the imperial family. Whether that's true or just urban myth, the idea of the emperor hopping onto a subway platform is almost absurdly comical, like spotting a celebrity on a public bus. You step into what looks like a larger chamber, its ceiling lined with ventilation shafts, now clogged with dust. The design suggests a meeting room, perhaps for wartime councils. Picture maps spread across tables, cigarettes burning down in ashtrays, aides scribbling notes, while the emperor himself might sit in silence, his presence enough to make every officer's hand tremble slightly. And yet, the strangest truth of all is that despite these preparations, the emperor rarely used these bunkers. He often remained in his palace above, even as bombs rained down, an act that blurred lines between bravery and ritual stubbornness. Still, the bunkers had purpose. You imagine secret telephones buzzing, connecting the military headquarters, or maybe shelves stocked with rice, canned fish, and emergency sake. Because if you're going to endure the apocalypse, a little warmth in a bottle probably helps. The floor beneath your boots feels uneven, as though worn down by hurried steps over years, though in reality, it may no more than be the drip of water warping concrete.
The hush here is almost suffocating. You pause, and suddenly you can hear it. The phantom murmur of strategists debating Japan's next move as the war closed in. Historians still argue whether decisions made underground lean toward prolonging resistance or quietly recognizing the inevitability of surrender. The irony, of course, is that the most consequential decision, the emperor's choice to record a surrender speech, wasn't made in these bunkers, but upstairs in his palace studio. Yet you can't help feeling these hidden chambers shaped the atmosphere of desperation that led to that turning point. Your flashlight beam skims a small side door, bolted shut. Behind it, who knows what remains? Dusty desks? Forgotten uniforms? Or maybe nothing but damp stone? A pang of curiosity stabs through you. If only you had the keys. But perhaps it's better this way. The mystery lingers, preserved by locked steel. You imagine the emperor walking these halls, his white robe swishing, flanked by guards with nervous eyes. Would he have felt reassured by the fortress-like walls, or trapped, as though even the sacred ruler had been reduced to hiding like a commoner? There's no answer, but it's a thought that turns history into something achingly human. And then, with a faint laugh under your breath, you realize if Netflix ever gets hold of this setting, they'd probably fill it with CGI secret doors and an emperor wielding a glowing sword. The reality is less cinematic, but far more haunting. Ordinary walls, meant to keep one man, and by extension a nation's soul, alive under siege. You linger a moment more, listening to the silence press in, then push on, deeper into the underbelly of Tokyo, the weight of the palace still echoing behind you.
You emerge from Tokyo's subterranean corridors into the humid air of Okinawa, where limestone cliffs rise like sentinels above a cerulean sea. The ground beneath your feet is rough and coral-studded, a reminder that the island itself has been hollowed out by human hands for purposes far darker than leisure snorkeling. You trudge over jagged rock, imagining the tangled network of caves carved into the island's interior during World War II. These aren't the type of caves you visit with a flashlight and a sense of adventure. These are war chambers, alive with history, carved meticulously by soldiers under the duress of invasion. You probably won't survive the imagined panic of crawling through their narrow entrances without imagining the desperation that once filled these spaces, but that's part of the eerie charm. One mainstream fact: Okinawa's cave fortresses were essential to Japanese defense during the 1945 Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Pacific. Soldiers dug deep into coral hills to create bunkers, ammunition depots, hospitals, and command posts. Historians still argue whether the caves prolonged the battle unnecessarily or provided the defenders with the strategic advantage that bought time for evacuation of civilians. The debate lingers in dusty archives and among Okinawan elders who remember the sounds of explosions echoing through these limestone corridors. As you step into a particularly narrow passage, your shoulders brush against the cool stone walls, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. You imagine soldiers crouched here, cleaning rifles, whispering to each other, praying that enemy planes wouldn't detect their hiding spots. Quirky tidbit: some tunnels were rumored to have secret sleeping quarters for monkeys trained to carry messages. Whether propaganda or practical, no one can confirm fully, but locals pass the story down with a grin.
Deeper still, the tunnels open into a large cavern, its ceiling carved into irregular arches that remind you of natural formations rather than human engineering. But every surface bears marks of human hands: carved steps, niches for lanterns, and inscriptions still faintly visible under layers of dust. You run your fingers over one of these markings, imagining an officer etching a reminder to ration water, perhaps nervously checking the horizon for approaching ships. The echoes here are strange. Your own footsteps and breathing amplify, mingling with imagined sounds of wartime chatter. The air grows colder as you move further into the labyrinth. You notice small openings to side chambers, many blocked with rubble or wooden barricades, some perfectly preserved. These were hiding spots for medical supplies, and in certain chambers, you could almost visualize the flickering of candlelight illuminating bandaged soldiers or injured civilians seeking refuge. Historians still argue whether the Japanese military adequately supplied these cave networks, or whether shortages led to unnecessary suffering. Regardless, you can sense the tension that must have filled these corridors, the balance between secrecy and survival. Quirky asides continue to catch your attention. Local lore speaks of soldiers leaving small trinkets inside caves, tiny carved wooden animals, coins, or messages intended to be found by those who might survive. Whether superstition or small acts of humanity, these relics transform the stark concrete and stone into intimate spaces, each telling a small story of resilience. You squat to inspect one tiny carving embedded in the wall, a rabbit perhaps, or a fox. You wonder who made it and why, and whether the hands that carved it ever returned to see it again. You pass a chamber with jagged stalactites peeking through, and the tunnel seems to narrow. Imagine crawling here, flashlight illuminating only what's directly ahead. You feel the claustrophobia pressing in, as soldiers must have felt while under the constant threat of Allied bombings. Some passages reportedly included hidden chambers where officers could coordinate attacks or retreat unnoticed. Historians still argue whether the cave's strategic design was fully realized, or if many tunnels ended abruptly, leaving soldiers to improvise. In a wider cavern, you notice a low bench carved into the stone wall. Maybe it served as a temporary mess hall or sleeping area. You sit for a moment, letting your mind drift to the original occupants. Did they talk about home, about food, about their families, about the life waiting above if they survived? Or were they silent, too focused on survival to speak? The human element hums through the stone, a quiet echo beneath the roar of history. And then, of course, there's the unavoidable irony. Today, Okinawa is a tourist paradise. Tour buses pull up, and groups pose for photos above tunnels where young soldiers once faced death daily. Historians still argue whether this commercialization honors or trivializes the memory of those who fought and hid in these caves. As you stand in the shadows, it feels less like judgment and more like reverence, simply witnessing the hidden past without disturbing it. You take a deep breath, feeling the humid scent of coral and earth fill your lungs, and you continue forward, following corridors that twist and fork endlessly. The farther you go, the more you realize these tunnels are alive with echoes, small relics of human ingenuity, desperation, and survival, carved painstakingly into the limestone heart of Okinawa.
You begin climbing the slopes of Mount Fuji, its peak shrouded in mist that curls like smoke from some ancient hearth. The air here is thinner, carrying the crisp scent of pine and volcanic rock, and every step crunches underfoot with a sharpness that makes you pause and imagine the layers of history beneath your boots. Deep within this sacred mountain, legends whisper of secret dugouts and subterranean chambers rumored to have been carved by the Japanese military during World War II. You trudge over jagged volcanic stone, imagining engineers and soldiers chiseling away in near silence, the occasional crack of rock echoing through cavernous hollows. You probably won't survive the hypothetical claustrophobia and altitude combined, but that's the thrill of this exploration, isn't it? A well-established fact is that during the late stages of the war, Japanese planners sought to create hidden mountain bases to house troops, weapons, and even command centers. Mount Fuji, given its symbolic and strategic prominence, was considered an ideal location for such secret facilities. Historians still argue whether these tunnels were fully constructed or largely remained plans on paper. Some sections exist, but many entrances were sealed or lost in volcanic soil and erosion over decades. Regardless, the aura of secrecy around Fuji's hidden chambers has fueled both military history studies and local legends. You crouch to peer into a narrow crevice, imagining it as a tunnel entrance, and it feels almost alive, a dark vein leading into the mountain's core. Soldiers may have crawled here daily, hauling supplies or weapons, perhaps whispering prayers to the sacred mountain gods for survival. Quirky tidbit,
Some local folklore insists that mystical fox spirits, kitsune, protected certain entrances, guiding the soldiers or scaring away intruders. While that's likely a colorful post-war myth, it adds an almost fairy tale quality to the otherwise grim wartime reality. As you follow the imaginary tunnels upward, the space opens into a cavern that could hold a small garrison. You imagine cots lining the walls, crates of ammunition stacked meticulously, and maps plastered to the stone. Light would have come only from oil lamps, flickering and casting shadows that danced across the rough surfaces. Historians still argue whether such mountain fortifications were ever meant to be fully operational defensive networks or more as contingency shelters, a final fallback should the home islands be invaded. The temperature drops, and your breath becomes visible in the stale air of these imagined tunnels. You reach a side chamber where channels cut into stone may have allowed water to flow, providing a crude supply for soldiers trapped within. Think about it. Engineering ingenuity mixed with the stress of impending defeat, people laboring under the expectation that the world above might disappear in fire. It's oddly humbling, this intersection of human ambition and sheer necessity.
Quirky tidbit number 2. Rumors claim that small shrines were carved into hidden corners of these tunnels, miniature Buddhist altars meant to protect the garrison's souls. You imagine the faint scent of incense lingering for decades, though now only the smell of damp stone remains. These shrines, if they existed, speak to the human need for spiritual anchors, even amid the mechanical, grim business of war. As you continue deeper, the tunnel branches. Some shafts lead into collapsed chambers, others twist out of sight. You run your hands along rough stone walls, etched with marks from chisels and hammers. Soldiers likely inscribed their names, dates, or brief messages, fleeting claims of existence amidst chaos. Historians still argue whether any of these tunnels were linked to larger supply networks across Honshu or remained isolated pockets of resistance. Your imagination wanders to the soldiers themselves, young men often barely out of boyhood, shivering in the cool mountain air, sharpening tools, rationing every drop of water. Some may have whispered letters into cracks in the stone, messages to loved ones they never expected to see again. The human element makes the stone breathe. It's more than a bunker. It's a repository of memory and fear. You pause in a wide chamber that could have served as a command post. Your flashlight glances over shallow pits that might have held communication equipment. The echo of distant wind through volcanic fissures mixes with imagined murmurs of strategy, plotting the defense of the homeland. And you can't help but chuckle softly. If someone were filming a spy thriller here, they'd probably have lasers and holograms, but in reality, it was just rock, sweat, and a lot of hope. Finally, you rise to the mouth of a tunnel, peering out at Fuji's slopes blanketed in mist. Somewhere in the mountain's heart, secret rooms may still lie hidden, untouched since 1945. Historians still argue whether these spaces were ever fully used or simply part of grand wartime fantasy plans. Either way, you can feel the mountain's silent weight, guarding stories that blend fact, rumor, and legend, all coiled into volcanic stone.
You shift your gaze northward to Hokkaido, where the air bites with a chill that nips at your cheeks and fills your lungs with the sharpness of snow and pine. The landscape is rugged, rolling hills giving way to dense forests, and the sense of isolation is immediate. Hidden within these northern reaches are bunkers carved to withstand a different kind of threat, the anticipated Soviet invasion in the closing months of World War II. Unlike the tropical humidity of Okinawa or the sacred slopes of Mount Fuji, Hokkaido's secret fortifications were designed for frost, wind, and an enemy that never arrived. You probably won't survive imagining the bone-chilling cold soldiers endured in these tunnels, but stepping into their shadows offers a haunting glimpse into the northernmost edges of Japan's wartime preparations. One mainstream fact:
The Japanese military built extensive fortifications in Hokkaido in 1944 to 45, anticipating a potential Soviet advance from the north. Many of these bunkers included ammunition storage, barracks, and even small command centers, all insulated against snow and freezing temperatures. Historians still argue whether these northern defenses were overbuilt or whether they truly served as a credible deterrent, given that the Soviet offensive never penetrated Japanese territory here. The uncertainty adds to the eerie allure of these snowbound structures. You trudge through a partially collapsed tunnel, boots crunching on gravel, imagining soldiers hauling heavy equipment through tight corridors while frost forms on the walls. Quirky tidbit: some bunkers reportedly housed experimental winter camouflage training areas where troops practiced disappearing into snowdrifts, blending seamlessly into Hokkaido's frozen forests. While the efficacy of these exercises remains debated, the idea of soldiers crouched like foxes in snow is strangely charming, almost cinematic. Deeper inside, the tunnel opens to a larger chamber with ventilation shafts extending upward. You picture command officers here, maps of the northern territories spread before them, pencils scratching out contingency plans, all while the wind howls outside like an invisible tide. Historians still argue whether these bunkers were ever fully operational or left partially unfinished due to resource shortages and the pressing collapse of Japan's broader war effort. Despite incomplete construction, the bunker's presence alone was a psychological shield against invasion. You notice the walls are lined with small niches, probably for storage of supplies like dried fish, rice, and even kerosene lamps. Imagine a soldier huddled here in the darkness, rationing a single cup of tea to last the week while listening to the eerie creaks of the frozen forest above. Quirky tidbit too. Locals have long whispered that small tunnels were occasionally used by foxes and raccoons after the war, leaving tiny footprints alongside the rusting human artifacts. This accidental post-war wildlife residency adds a touch of levity to an otherwise austere environment.
As you navigate further, the floor slopes downward into a narrow passage, the walls slick with ice in places. You wonder if soldiers had to scrape frost off their bedding, or if condensation made uniforms damp and uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether maintaining these northern fortifications was a strategic necessity or an overextension driven by paranoia. But standing here, you can feel the meticulous attention to detail. Reinforced ceilings, small alcoves for artillery observers, even hidden ventilation designed to prevent smoke buildup from fires used to cook meals. The chill intensifies, and you wrap your imagined coat tighter around yourself. You pass what seems to be a small sleeping area, benches carved into stone, perhaps for enlisted men, and a tiny hearth still blackened by soot. You picture these soldiers laughing quietly, sharing stories, or maybe quietly thinking of home, Hokkaido's northern lights flickering in the distance above ground as they hunker down below. Another striking feature: some tunnels purportedly contain concealed communication lines, allowing officers to relay messages across the island without emerging into freezing exposure. Historians still argue whether these lines ever transmitted meaningful intelligence or remained largely theoretical. Regardless, they reflect an ingenuity born of necessity, a network crafted in secrecy, frozen in time. You pause to admire a small alcove with carved steps leading up to a ventilation slit, letting in a thin beam of pale daylight. Through that shaft, frost glitters on pine needles, and you can almost imagine a soldier peering out, scanning for approaching threats, each breath a plume in the cold air. There's a sense of vigilance, isolation, and quiet heroism in these spaces that the casual tourist never experiences. Finally, you step out of the tunnel into an open clearing. The forest spreads in every direction, untouched and serene, while you reflect on the paradox of Hokkaido's bunkers, built for war that never came, filled with meticulous care for a threat that remained a phantom. Yet their stones, ice, and hidden alcoves preserve memory, offering a silent tribute to preparation, endurance, and the human instinct to fortify against the unknown.
As you navigate further, the floor slopes downward into a narrow passage, the walls slick with ice in places. You wonder if soldiers had to scrape frost off their bedding, or if condensation made uniforms damp and uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether maintaining these northern fortifications was a strategic necessity or an overextension driven by paranoia. But standing here, you can feel the meticulous attention to detail. Reinforced ceilings, small alcoves for artillery observers, even hidden ventilation designed to prevent smoke buildup from fires used to cook meals. The chill intensifies, and you wrap your imagined coat tighter around yourself. You pass what seems to be a small sleeping area, benches carved into stone, perhaps for enlisted men, and a tiny hearth still blackened by soot. You picture these soldiers laughing quietly, sharing stories, or maybe quietly thinking of home, Hokkaido's northern lights flickering in the distance above ground as they hunker down below. Another striking feature: some tunnels reportedly contained concealed communication lines, allowing officers to relay messages across the island without emerging into freezing exposure. Historians still argue whether these lines ever transmitted meaningful intelligence or remain largely theoretical. Regardless, they reflect an ingenuity born of necessity, a network crafted in secrecy, frozen in time. You pause to admire a small alcove with carved steps leading up to a ventilation slit, letting in a thin beam of pale daylight. Through that shaft, frost glitters on pine needles, and you can almost imagine a soldier peering out, scanning for approaching threats, each breath a plume in the cold air. There's a sense of vigilance, isolation, and quiet heroism in these spaces that the casual tourist never experiences. Finally, you step out of the tunnel into an open clearing. The forest spreads in every direction, untouched and serene, while you reflect on the paradox of Hokkaido's bunkers, built for war that never came, filled with meticulous care for a threat that remained a phantom. Yet their stones, ice, and hidden alcoves preserve memory, offering a silent tribute to preparation, endurance, and the human instinct to fortify against the unknown. The air grows damp as you descend into lower tunnels. You can feel the volcanic heat seeping through the walls, mingling with the salty scent of the ocean. You notice small alcoves, possibly designed for snipers to peek out or for storing machine guns, and you imagine the soldiers moving silently, shifting positions with practiced precision. Quirky tidbit 2, some reports suggest that certain tunnels contained hidden escape routes leading to underground caves along the coast, allowing small units to vanish from one end of the island to another undetected. Whether true or exaggerated, it adds a thrilling layer to the already complex design. As you navigate, you stumble upon carved inscriptions, names, dates, tiny prayers scratched into the rock. You picture soldiers leaving these personal marks, little defiant signatures in the midst of chaos. Historians still argue whether these carvings were intentional morale boosters, messages to family, or mere acts of boredom and human expression. The presence of these markings makes the tunnel feel less like cold stone and more like a living diary of desperation and courage. You round a corner and the tunnel opens into a cavern large enough to serve as a command center. Imagine maps pinned to walls, small lamps casting trembling shadows, officers whispering, radios crackling, orders scribbled in haste. The contrast with the serene landscape outside is stark. Above ground, waves lap calmly at black sand. Below, The hum of human determination and fear vibrates through rock. Another eerie aspect. Some tunnels were reportedly designed to channel the smell of smoke and gunpowder away from entrances, a rudimentary ventilation system that could save lives. Historians still argue whether this system actually functioned as intended or whether it was largely theoretical. Standing in the chamber, you can almost sense the ghosts of those who once relied on these innovations for survival, their presence lingering in the air like a faint echo. Finally, you climb a set of uneven stone steps leading toward an exit that faces the volcanic coastline. The sun catches the black sand, sparkling like crushed glass. You pause, imagining the soldiers emerging into the light for brief moments of reconnaissance, aware that every second above ground could be fatal. The tunnels of Iwo Jima, carved from volcanic rock, bear silent testimony to ingenuity, desperation, and the will to endure against overwhelming odds.
You drift southward in your mind to the subtropical islands of the Ryukyu chain, where Okinawa's serene beaches hide a network of military bunkers that twist and coil beneath jagged cliffs. The warm salt breeze brushes your face as you imagine climbing down hidden stairways into darkness, the air thick with humidity and the faint tang of mold. You probably won't survive imagining the oppressive heat mixed with the fear soldiers must have felt, but it's impossible not to feel drawn into the secret world below ground, where strategy and survival intermingled like shadows on stone. One mainstream fact: during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, Japanese forces created over 1,000 caves and bunkers throughout the islands, many fortified with reinforced concrete, steel doors, and cleverly concealed entrances. Historians still argue whether these elaborate fortifications prolonged the conflict unnecessarily or provided vital defensive leverage against a numerically superior force. Regardless, stepping into these structures is like slipping into a frozen moment in time, where every scratch and chip in the wall tells a story. You imagine sliding down a narrow shaft into a cramped corridor, the walls damp and cool under your fingertips. Soldiers would have shuffled here for hours, carrying ammunition, tending to the wounded, or simply waiting for orders. Quirky tidbit: some bunkers reportedly included sound traps, angled ceilings and walls designed to amplify footsteps or whispers in one area while masking them elsewhere. Whether these were truly effective or a wartime superstition is still debated, but the concept is brilliant, like acoustic espionage embedded in stone.
Deeper inside, the tunnels open into wider chambers, some large enough to serve as meeting halls or mess areas. Picture soldiers huddled over bowls of rice, smoke curling from kerosene lamps, whispers of loved ones carried in memory as the ocean roared silently above ground. Historians still argue whether these chambers were primarily functional or whether psychological impact, making soldiers feel safe in the labyrinth, was equally significant. The walls bear scratch marks and tiny inscriptions, names, dates, maybe prayers or jokes scribbled in fleeting moments of humanity amidst chaos. You wander through one particularly complex series of passageways, your flashlight revealing branching corridors that twist unpredictably. Soldiers would have memorized every turn, every alcove, every potential hiding place for enemy forces. Quirky tidbit 2. Some bunkers reportedly contained miniature gardens with potted plants or herbs to boost morale and provide a semblance of normalcy. Imagining these tiny green spaces amidst stone and sweat is strangely comforting, a reminder that life persists even in the darkest places. The tunnels rise and fall like a subterranean landscape, with hidden stairways leading to ventilation shafts or secret exits. You imagine officers studying maps under lamplight, plotting troop movements and rationing supplies with painstaking precision. Historians still argue whether these Ryukyu tunnels were fully exploited tactically or simply served as symbolic fortifications that demonstrated Japanese ingenuity and resolve. The debate itself adds a layer of intrigue, making you wonder what might have happened if the enemy had discovered every hidden nook. You step into a low chamber, the ceiling pressing down, and imagine the young soldiers crouching here, whispering encouragement or silently calculating their odds. A faint breeze from a crack in the rock carries the scent of the sea and a hint of something organic, perhaps a remnant of wartime food stores or decomposed plant matter left to mingle with the stone. Quirky tidbit 3. Some tunnels were rumored to include small pools of rainwater for emergencies, occasionally housing tiny fish or frogs, which soldiers reportedly considered good luck. Finally, you emerge from a side exit carved into the cliffside, the sun blazing down and waves crashing below. The juxtaposition is almost surreal. Above, life continues in serene rhythm. Below, history is trapped in labyrinthine stone, preserved in sweat, fear, and ingenuity. These Okinawan bunkers remain silent witnesses to one of the most intense and desperate campaigns of the Pacific Theater, blending strategy, superstition, and human resilience into their enduring architecture.
You travel in your imagination to the mountainous interior of Kyushu, the island where volcanic peaks and misted valleys create natural fortresses that were pressed into service during the final years of World War II. Here, you wander along narrow trails, barely visible beneath overgrown ferns and moss, the air cool and fragrant with pine and damp earth. You probably won't survive imagining the soldiers navigating these terrains in full gear, hauling supplies through hidden bunkers, but stepping into the imagined labyrinth is exhilarating. Every twist of the path, every shadowed crevice could hide entrances to tunnels, some mundane, some holding the secrets of wartime ingenuity. One mainstream fact: the Japanese military constructed numerous underground bunkers throughout Kyushu, particularly near key industrial cities like Nagasaki and Kumamoto, to protect command centers, ammunition stockpiles, and communication lines. Historians still argue whether these bunkers were built primarily as functional shelters or as a psychological statement of resilience to maintain morale among soldiers and civilians. Walking the imagined corridors, you sense both intentions at play: pragmatism and symbolism intertwined in cold stone. You step into the entrance of a particularly hidden bunker, the concrete walls slick with condensation, the air carrying the faint smell of mold and iron. Soldiers may have crouched here for hours, moving cautiously to avoid alerting aerial reconnaissance. Quirky tidbit: some Kyushu bunkers reportedly included small underground gardens meant to provide herbs and vegetables to sustain troops, though their efficacy is debated. Imagining a handful of green sprouts thriving amid stone and darkness brings a whimsical contrast to the otherwise grim surroundings. Deeper inside, you descend a staircase carved into volcanic rock. The walls bear faint inscriptions: dates, names, perhaps prayers for survival. Historians still argue whether these markings were intentional morale boosters, messages to loved ones, or casual graffiti left by bored soldiers. The inscriptions turn cold, lifeless walls into a diary of human endurance, each etched letter a voice frozen in stone.
The corridors twist and branch unpredictably, almost like a subterranean maze designed to confuse invaders. You picture small squads moving silently, coordinating with whispered signals, while officers confer in a central chamber. Quirky tidbit 2, some bunkers included hidden compartments for carrying pigeons used in wartime communication. The idea of birds darting through confined tunnels seems almost absurd, yet it represents the creative lengths the Japanese military went to maintain contact and control. The tunnel's floors are uneven, carved directly from volcanic rock, forcing soldiers to shuffle carefully to avoid injury. Ventilation shafts are narrow, and the stale air carries the echoes of footsteps, distant dripping water, and perhaps even the faint murmur of voices from decades past. Historians still argue whether these ventilation systems were fully functional or merely partial attempts to improve air circulation. Regardless, you can feel the effort put into every detail, a testament to wartime ingenuity under pressure. You reach a larger chamber, possibly serving as a command post, with alcoves for maps, communication equipment, and even modest sleeping arrangements. Imagine soldiers huddled over rough tables, calculating logistics, rationing rice, and quietly discussing strategies to hold the island against overwhelming odds. Quirky tidbit 3, some chambers were said to contain tiny statues of protective deities meant to protect soldiers from harm, blending superstition and practical architecture in a delicate balance. As you wander further, you notice remnants of fire pits, scorch marks on the ceiling, and niches that might have held lamps. You imagine medics tending to the injured by dim lamplight, the weight of responsibility pressing down on them as heavily as the stone above. Historians still argue whether these makeshift medical stations effectively saved lives or simply prolonged suffering in an already dire situation. Each carved space tells a story of struggle, ingenuity, and endurance under unimaginable stress.
You take a moment to lean against a cold wall, listening to the distant echoes of the mountain wind funneling through cracks above ground. You can almost hear whispers of soldiers practicing drills, murmuring prayers, or simply passing the long hours of darkness together. The quiet hum of the mountain contrasts sharply with the imagined tension below, making it easy to feel both awe and melancholy. The corridors eventually lead to multiple exit points, some well concealed behind natural rock formations, others subtly marked with inconspicuous stone arrangements. Soldiers would have memorized these paths, a survival instinct honed over countless drills. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these exits was overkill or genuinely increased the chances of survival against air raids and ground assaults. You, standing in this imagined space, can feel both the logic and the psychological comfort provided by having multiple escape routes. Quirky tidbit 4, local folklore suggests some tunnels were connected to hidden hot springs, allowing soldiers brief moments of warmth and solace. While this may be exaggerated, the mental image of a soldier soaking in mineral-rich waters beneath a volcanic peak adds a strangely comforting, almost surreal touch to the otherwise austere environment. As you navigate deeper, the air grows colder, carrying the subtle scent of mineral-rich rock and decomposed organic matter. You imagine soldiers carefully rationing food, checking weaponry, and recording reports in notebooks that would later vanish into the chaos of war. Historians still argue whether these tunnels were systematically maintained or gradually fell into disuse as Japan's strategic situation deteriorated. Whatever the case, the stone corridors preserve a narrative of human adaptability, courage, and quiet endurance. You round a corner into a cavern with rough stone benches and small niches along the walls. Soldiers might have slept here in shifts, listening for enemy movement above ground. The faint sound of wind through fissures and cracks mixes with imagined echoes of conversation, creating a sense of life lingering long after the tunnel's active use ended. Quirky tidbit 5, some chambers reportedly had small, hidden stashes of sake, meant to boost morale or mark celebrations of small victories. It's funny, almost, to picture soldiers sharing a clandestine drink in the heart of a volcanic fortress. Eventually, the tunnels twist upward, leading to a concealed exit on a moss-covered hillside. Stepping outside, the misted forests of Kyushu stretch endlessly, serene and untouched, as though decades of war had never touched them. You pause to reflect. Beneath this tranquil landscape lies a labyrinth of stone and human willpower, a place where ingenuity, superstition, endurance, and fear collided. The Kyushu bunkers, with their twists, alcoves, and hidden chambers, are a testament not only to military strategy, but also to human resilience in the face of an uncertain, often terrifying future.
Your journey now carries you to the volcanic cliffs of Chichijima, part of the Ogasawara Islands, where the Pacific swells crash relentlessly against jagged rock faces. The salt tang in the air mixes with the faint scent of tropical vegetation, and you trudge along narrow ridges, imagining hidden entrances tucked between jagged boulders. You probably won't survive picturing the soldiers who labored here under oppressive heat and constant threat of naval bombardment, but that's the allure. Every footstep could reveal the remnants of secret WW2 bunkers etched into the island's volcanic heart. One mainstream fact: the Japanese military established extensive underground fortifications on Chichijima to protect against potential American naval invasions. These bunkers included ammunition storage, small command centers, and hidden observation posts. Historians still argue whether the island's strategic value justified the labor-intensive construction or whether they were primarily symbolic, intended to demonstrate Japan's resolve to defend even its most remote outposts. As you descend into a hidden shaft, the air shifts. The cool shade contrasts with the tropical heat above, carrying a subtle dampness that hints at centuries of volcanic activity. Quirky tidbit: some tunnels reportedly included secret chambers designed to store tropical fruits and vegetables, an unusual consideration for soldiers in a combat zone. While it may sound whimsical, it reflects an attention to morale and sustenance that historians often overlook. Inside the network of tunnels, you imagine soldiers moving cautiously, equipment clanking softly against stone walls. Ventilation shafts allow limited airflow, creating a draft that carries the distant echo of waves crashing below. Historians still argue whether the ventilation systems were fully effective or merely partially functional, but in these confined spaces, any hint of moving air would have been welcome relief. Deeper into the labyrinth, you encounter a chamber large enough for a temporary command post. Imagine officers hunched over maps under the flickering light of oil lamps, plotting defensive maneuvers while listening for the faint rumble of ships on the horizon. Quirky tidbit 2, some rooms contain small carvings of native birds, etched by soldiers during rare quiet moments. These artistic touches, though minor, humanize the otherwise grim stone environment, blending creativity with the mechanics of survival. The corridors twist unpredictably, a deliberate design to confuse potential intruders. Soldiers memorized every turn, relying on their knowledge of hidden alcoves and narrow escape routes. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these tunnels genuinely enhanced defense or simply reflected a symbolic commitment to preparedness. Regardless, navigating them today, even in imagination, evokes a sense of both awe and disorientation.
You pause to imagine a makeshift medical bay, a low-ceilinged room with cots and basic supplies. The faint scent of antiseptic or medicinal herbs mingled with the stone, and you picture medics quietly tending to wounded soldiers, their hands steady despite exhaustion. Quirky tidbit 3, local legend claims some tunnels were inhabited by tiny geckos that soldiers considered good luck, and spotting one was believed to indicate survival through the next day. Superstition and practicality intertwine seamlessly here. Further along, you reach a concealed exit leading to a cliffside lookout. You can almost feel the wind ruffling your hair, the Pacific stretching endlessly beyond, while below, hidden from view, the complex tunnel system hums with imagined activity. Historians still argue whether such lookout points were heavily utilized or if they were primarily meant as psychological deterrents. Standing here, the thought of both tactical advantage and psychological impact feels tangible, as if every step through the tunnels was guided by strategy and instinct. The tunnels were often interconnected with small supply rooms, each containing barrels of rice, canned goods, and occasionally rationed water. Soldiers carefully maintained these spaces, aware that any lapse could have severe consequences. Quirky tidbit 4, some chambers reportedly included small engraved messages meant to boost morale, like "Ganbatte" or "We will endure," etched into stone. Imagine the quiet hope in those words, flickering like faint lamplight against cold walls. Finally, you emerge from a hidden exit onto a sunlit ridge, the waves roaring below and the tropical wind carrying the scent of salt and distant blooms. These Chichijima bunkers, hidden in plain sight beneath volcanic rock, are enduring reminders of preparation, human ingenuity, and resilience. They encapsulate not only the strategic mind of wartime planners, but also the quiet, often overlooked moments of humanity,
The carvings, the superstitions, and the tiny acts of hope that sustain soldiers in the most isolated and forbidding corners of the Pacific.
You step down into the Tokyo subway, and the first thing you notice is how polished everything feels. Gleaming tiles, blinking lights, automated announcements that sound more cheerful than most people's morning moods. Trains roar in, commuters shuffle out. Everyone is glued to their phones like they're scrolling for survival. To you, it feels routine, almost too clean, almost too efficient. But if you pause, tilt your head just a little, and imagine peeling back the years like wallpaper, the shine fades into something darker. You're not just standing in a train station, you're standing inside a war bunker. Because that's what parts of this underground web were designed to be. Not just a transport system, but a survival machine for a city on the verge of collapse. Picture it, Tokyo, 1944. The American bombing campaigns have begun to turn the night sky into a theater of fire. You're down here, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, clutching whatever you managed to grab before the sirens screamed. It's not a phone or a briefcase. It's a water flask, a blanket, maybe your child's hand if you were lucky enough to scoop them out of bed before the bombs fell. Above, the city burns. Below, the tunnels hum with fear. And here's the twist of irony. The same tunnels that today carry millions of commuters with absolute precision were in their infancy repurposed as crude shelters. Engineers carved out side chambers, reinforced certain areas, and disguised hidden doors as if they were routine maintenance panels. They couldn't stop the city from burning, but they could at least give you a place to cower when the firestorms came. You know those yellow safety lines painted along the edge of modern platforms? Back then, people clung to that edge for dear life, not because they feared falling onto the tracks, but because the vibrations of distant bombs made the whole world feel like it was shaking apart. One mainstream historical fact that surfaces here, the Ginza Line, Tokyo's oldest subway line, became a literal lifeline during the raids of 1945. Crowds crammed onto the platforms, sometimes so densely packed that people fainted from lack of air. The Japanese authorities even printed small guidebooks telling civilians which subway stations were safest during different types of raids, like a grim version of today's train timetables.
And if that sounds organized, wait until you hear the quirky part. People actually brought picnic baskets down here. Yes, you heard me right, picnics during air raids. Some families, desperate to comfort their kids, turned nights underground into makeshift camping trips. Rice balls wrapped in cloth, miso soup and flasks. Even sweets passed around to distract children from the sounds above. Can you imagine trying to chew calmly while the earth vibrated with explosions? It's a little like ordering popcorn during a horror movie. Sure, it feels absurd, but your brain clings to any scrap of normalcy when chaos reigns. Still, historians argue whether these subway shelters were ever truly safe. Some claim the concrete ceilings and reinforced walls could withstand most conventional bombs. Others point out that the firebombing raids weren't about precision strikes. They created massive infernos that sucked oxygen out of entire neighborhoods. No matter how strong the walls, the real threat was suffocation. And if the air didn't get you, collapsing debris might. So safety was always relative, a desperate hope rather than a guarantee. Now let's play a game of sensory time travel. Close your eyes, well, metaphorically because you're listening, and imagine yourself in Shinjuku Station in 1945. The lights flicker, they're running on emergency power. The air smells damp, metallic, tinged with kerosene smoke seeping from above. You hear distant sirens, and then the deep, gut-churning thump of explosions. Dust trickles from the ceiling with every shockwave. Children whimper, mothers whisper prayers. Somewhere, a transistor radio plays a patriotic song, tinny and defiant. And you sit cross-legged against the wall, knees knocking together, telling yourself that the earth above won't cave in tonight. Meanwhile, the Japanese authorities were quietly doing more than just offering protection. They were preparing these underground systems for something bigger. Some subway branches were reinforced not just as shelters, but as potential command posts. Hidden side rooms, never marked on civilian maps, may have been intended for military or government use. Imagine boarding a train and not knowing that 2 doors down there's a steel-reinforced chamber where officials might have planned a last stand. That's the eerie overlap of ordinary life and wartime secrecy. You can never be sure what part of the tunnel is just concrete and what part is a mask for something else. And here's a tidbit that'll stick in your head the next time you grab a drink from a vending machine. During the war, some subway stations had underground wells dug to provide emergency water. People used them to fight fires or just to stay hydrated during long raids. After the war, most were sealed, but a few remain hidden behind service doors. Next time you sip a bottle of Pocari Sweat on a platform, remember, 70-odd years ago, someone may have drawn water from the same underground aquifer while firebombs rained above.
There's also the weird psychological effect of being down there. Survivors recalled how time warped. Hours underground felt like days. Some said the constant rumble of bombs made it feel like living inside a giant drum. Others joked, dark humor of course, that Tokyo's subways gave them the best sleep of their lives because exhaustion eventually won over fear. You have to love human resilience. If people can joke about sleeping through an apocalypse, then maybe the species isn't doomed after all. Fast forward to today, and here you are again in the same Tokyo subway. The air smells of perfume, coffee, maybe a faint whiff of fried chicken from Lawson's. Everything feels modern, fast, safe. Yet, hidden in the walls, you know there are remnants, bricked-up doors, side tunnels that don't appear on maps, storage rooms whose real origins are never explained. Engineers sometimes stumble upon them during renovations, rusted signage, old ventilation shafts, even the outlines of rooms that once held terrified families. And here's the kicker. Modern Tokyo's subway system is so vast, so labyrinthine, that even locals joke about never really knowing where they are. It's a running gag. You take the wrong exit and suddenly you're in a parallel universe. But add in the knowledge that some of those passages were once life or death shelters, and the joke takes on a darker flavor. You're not just lost in the subway, you're lost in history. So next time you're in Tokyo, waiting for your train while scrolling your phone, glance at the walls. That sealed steel door you barely notice, it might not lead to an electrical panel at all. It might open into a chamber that once echoed with whispered prayers and the rattling breath of people waiting for the night to pass. And the floor beneath your sneakers? It has already carried more weight than you can imagine. Millions of footsteps, yes, but also the heavy silence of survival. And isn't that the strangest part? That this humming, brightly lit system of punctual trains is built on the bones of fear? That the daily commute is layered over nights of desperation? That ordinary Tokyoites today unknowingly walk through the same tunnels where their grandparents once decided whether to eat a rice ball or just hold their breath and hope the world didn't collapse? Funny, isn't it? You thought the scariest part of the Tokyo subway was trying to change trains at Shinjuku. Turns out that's child's play compared to the real horror that once unfolded down here.
You climb back up the steps of the subway in your mind, shake off the flicker of fluorescent lights, and the scene shifts. Suddenly, it's not wartime Tokyo civilians you're shadowing, but wide-eyed American GIs in dusty uniforms. The war has ended. Japan has surrendered. The streets above are filled with rubble and silence. And the Americans, armed not with bombs now, but with clipboards, lanterns, and a gnawing curiosity, are about to stumble into the underworld that the Japanese military left behind. Think of it as the world's most unnerving scavenger hunt. You're one of these young soldiers, maybe 19, from Kansas or Ohio, and you've been told to go poke around those tunnels over there. You descend with your flashlight bouncing on the concrete walls, expecting maybe rats, maybe some leftover rifles. Instead, you find rooms that look like they belong in a samurai drama. Tatami mats, painted scrolls, tea sets arranged as if the generals had just stepped out for a smoke break. The official post-war reports confirm it. American teams discovered not just stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, but fully furnished underground rooms, complete with paper screens, ceremonial calligraphy, and, in some cases, partially eaten meals. Imagine that. Walking into a bunker and finding a half-empty sake bottle waiting for you, as if the warlords would return any minute. And it wasn't all theater. There were very practical discoveries, too. Caches of rifles wrapped in oiled cloth, crates of grenades stacked neatly, barrels of aviation fuel hidden behind false walls, maps, thousands of them, detailing everything from urban sewer layouts to mountain passes. These were blueprints for a war that, had it dragged on even a few more months, might have turned into a gruesome underground guerrilla fight. One mainstream historical fact jumps out here. The Americans documented a vast network of underground aircraft research facilities, particularly in Nagano and Gifu prefectures. These were meant to be safe from bombing raids, tucked into hillsides and reinforced by concrete. Some facilities had begun experimenting with jet engines, secret weapons that Japan hoped might turn the tide. Of course, the tide had already gone out. The surrender came before these weapons could be mass-produced. Still, the thought lingers. You could be walking into a damp tunnel and standing inches away from the ghost of a jet engine project that never quite took off.
But then come the quirky finds, the ones that sound more like urban legends than army reports. One group of GIs reported stumbling on an underground chamber decorated with kabuki costumes, masks, and props. Was it a storage room for cultural artifacts hidden from firebombing? Or had some officer been staging underground plays to pass the time while the world above collapsed? Historians scratch their heads because the records are patchy and the artifacts vanished into the fog of occupation. Maybe some soldier smuggled a kabuki mask back home in his duffel bag, and it's sitting today in a Midwestern attic mistaken for a Halloween decoration. Other oddities cropped up too. Small Buddhist altars tucked into bunker corners, elaborate calligraphy scrolls declaring loyalty to the emperor, even underground offices with typewriters and telephones still connected to lines that had long gone dead. One GI wrote in his diary about opening a heavy steel door only to find a room filled wall-to-wall with chairs. Hundreds of chairs, no desks, no papers, just rows upon rows of seating facing a blank wall. A meeting room? A lecture hall? A ceremonial chamber? No one knows. Historians still argue whether these rooms were practical or symbolic. Were they meant to coordinate resistance, or were they just meant to look intimidating if anyone ever found them? And then, of course, there were the bunkers under the Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo. The Americans were stunned to find a command center directly beneath the emperor's residence. Thick-walled chambers with reinforced steel ceilings, designed as a last redoubt for the imperial government. The palace above might burn, but beneath it, the machinery of rule would survive. Some scholars believe that if Japan hadn't surrendered after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final battles might have been directed from these subterranean halls. The Americans took photographs, wrote reports, and then quietly locked much of it away. To this day, many of those chambers remain off-limits, sealed behind polite signs and well-guarded gates. Now, imagine yourself again as that 19-year-old GI, flashlight trembling in your hand. You turn a corner, expecting another room of rifles. Instead, you find a lacquered table set with ink brushes and maps of the Pacific. Or you stumble on a pile of school books. Yes, actual children's textbooks stacked in a bunker next to grenades. Were these meant to be used in propaganda schools underground? Or were they just stolen from above to light fires, read in boredom, or calm nerves? No one really knows. That's the thing about discovery. The objects themselves survive, but their stories dissolve. One diary entry from an American officer describes something almost cinematic, a chamber where the walls were lined with mirrors. At first, the soldiers thought it was a trick, some kind of trap. Then they realized it was likely part of a medical facility. Mirrors to expand light, to make underground surgeries easier. It's a detail that chills you because you can almost hear the echo of scalpels clinking, the moans of wounded men being operated on in the flickering glow of lanterns.
And here's the fringe tidbit to keep your imagination buzzing. Rumors swirled among the occupation forces that some of these bunkers weren't just storage sites, they were laboratories. Not in the Frankenstein with lightning bolt sense, but experiments with chemicals, with biological weapons, with last-ditch technologies meant to scare off invaders. American intelligence files later hinted at underground experiments in Unit 731's orbit, though most evidence was either destroyed or spirited away. Historians still argue whether the Americans deliberately covered up what they found in exchange for securing Japanese scientific data. Was it pragmatic Cold War politics, or a moral failure buried in concrete? And as you're walking through these tunnels, remember, the soldiers didn't know what was waiting behind each steel door. Would it be rifles or relics? Grenades or golden altars? Half the time it was just damp concrete and spider webs. The other half, it was like opening a time capsule sealed by desperation. One American corporal later admitted that exploring these bunkers was more unnerving than combat itself. In battle, at least you knew who the enemy was and where the front lay. Down here, in the silence, the enemy was your own imagination. Every drip of water sounded like footsteps. Every draft felt like a ghost brushing your arm. And sometimes the bunkers seemed too carefully abandoned, almost as if their occupants had just slipped away a moment before. Even now, walking through Japan's modern streets, you realize that the Americans didn't uncover everything. Some tunnels were sealed before they arrived. Some were mapped but later forgotten. Some may still lie waiting beneath office towers and convenience stores, their secrets locked behind reinforced steel. And if you've ever wondered why conspiracy theories cling to Tokyo's underground like mold, this is why. The Americans found so much, and yet they admitted they hadn't found it all. So the next time you see an old GI's war trunk at a flea market filled with Japanese souvenirs, pause for a second. That kabuki mask, that teacup, that scroll, it might not have come from a shop. It might have been pulled from the dust of an underground world, carried across the Pacific by a kid who couldn't quite believe the things he'd seen. And if you're thinking, well, at least all the secrets are gone now, let me just remind you, entire archives of U.S. occupation reports are still sealed. Some pages redacted, others quietly withheld. Which means, even today, the story of what those GIs discovered underground is only half told. The rest of it, still waiting in the shadows.
You stand again at the edge of one of these half-forgotten bunkers, the entrance yawning like a dark mouth hidden under ivy. Yet as you gaze into it, your mind travels beyond Japan, beyond the particularities of Tokyo or Okinawa, to the wider world. You begin to compare what you've seen here with other wartime landscapes. And slowly, a pattern forms. Every nation that faced the apocalypse of modern war dug into the earth, as if survival required retreating into the body of the planet itself. But Japan's bunkers feel different. Underground echoes across the world. You recall the dank tunnels of London's underground during the Blitz, where families huddled together on train platforms, bedding spread across the tracks, songs and stories told to soothe terrified children. In Britain, the shelters became symbols of endurance, images proudly photographed for newspapers. They were not hidden, they were celebrated, folded into the mythology of keep calm and carry on. Germany's bunkers, too, were vast, flak towers rising like medieval fortresses, deep Führer bunkers and command centers where Hitler and his generals planned their doomed defenses. Today, many stand exposed as ruins, reminders of both ambition and collapse. Some are tourist attractions, others memorials, but their very visibility ensures they remain part of collective memory. Even in France, the Maginot Line's tunnels, built before the war during the anxious interwar years, remain open in places, monuments to a strategy that failed yet still commands fascination. But Japan's bunkers tell a quieter story, buried not only under soil, but under layers of silence. They were dug in haste, often under schools, hospitals, factories, and private homes. They were not meant to be symbols, nor even primarily defensive structures. They were shelters of desperation, spaces of secrecy. And unlike the West, Japan rarely mythologized them after the war. They linger in shadows, half forgotten, half suppressed. Cultural silence and sealed entrances. You trace this silence back to cultural memory. Post-war Japan rebuilt itself not only physically but psychologically, deliberately shifting attention toward peace, productivity, and the future. The devastation of the firebombings and atomic bombs was remembered, yes, but the everyday bunkers, the small civilian shelters, the military tunnels, often faded into neglect. Why? Perhaps because they symbolized defeat, not heroism. Unlike London's tube stations, which embodied resilience, Japan's shelters whispered of vulnerability. They were places where families cowered, where survival was uncertain, where shame and desperation mingled. To preserve them would mean to preserve a reminder of powerlessness. So many entrances were bricked up, camouflaged, erased. The earth swallowed them, and society seemed content to let memory fade. Yet the earth is stubborn. Concrete endures. And when redevelopment digs too deep, when archaeologists or curious locals peel back the soil, these chambers resurface, demanding recognition. You think of the schoolchildren in Osaka who once stumbled on a tunnel system while playing near a hillside, or the construction crews in Yokohama who discovered hidden bunkers beneath what was to become an apartment block. Each time, the press covered the discovery briefly, but then the stories faded again, returning to silence, living with the unseen. Yet silence does not mean absence. As you walk through a suburban Tokyo neighborhood, you realize how many lives are unknowingly built upon these voids. A mother hangs laundry over a patch of grass that conceals an air raid shelter. A businessman rushes to the train, never realizing that beneath the station's concrete lies a warren of wartime command tunnels. Children ride their bicycles across streets that overlay sealed vaults, their play unknowing of the darkness below. This is the uncanny truth. The past is still physically there, but socially invisible. People live on top of history without recognizing it. The bunkers have become an invisible layer of the urban fabric, as though modern Japan floats a few meters above another buried country, one made of concrete, steel doors, and silence. And you wonder, what does it do to a culture to live with so much buried memory? Encounters with survivors. When you talk to older Japanese, those who remember the war, the stories emerge like water from a crack in stone. An old woman describes huddling in a school basement bunker, clutching her younger brother as flames consumed her neighborhood. She remembers the suffocating air, the drip of water down the walls, the way her brother trembled until he fainted. An elderly man recalls serving as a student laborer ordered to help dig tunnels near Kyoto. He described swinging a pickaxe for hours, his hands blistering, his lungs filled with dust. The officers told them the bunkers would protect their leaders, maybe even the emperor himself, though he never saw such figures. He only saw hunger, exhaustion, and fear. These voices, fragile with age, remind you that the bunkers are not simply ruins. They are vessels of lived experience. Every wall holds breath. Every floor holds footsteps. To ignore them is to ignore human memory. The tension between memory and forgetting. As you continue to reflect, you recognize a deeper tension. Nations choose which parts of their past to highlight and which to suppress. Japan, like all countries, has struggled with how to remember World War II, whether as victim of atomic devastation, as aggressor in Asia, or as a defeated empire. Bunkers do not fit neatly into any single narrative. They are not monuments of glory, nor pure symbols of suffering. They are ambiguous, spaces of both civilian endurance and military secrecy. So they linger in limbo, half-remembered. When preserved as museums, they often attract only modest interest.
The global mirror. And so you return to your earlier comparisons, where Britain celebrates its shelters, Germany confronts its bunkers, and France maintains its lines. Japan seems to look away. Yet perhaps this very act of looking away reveals as much about cultural psychology as preservation would. The silence itself is part of the story, part of how nations heal or fail to heal from trauma. You realize then that to explore these bunkers is not only to descend into history's physical remains, but also to descend into memory's shadows, into the choices societies make about what to keep visible and what to let vanish underground. Walking away. As evening falls, you step back from the ivy-clad entrance and glance around. Life hums in the present, buses passing, shop shutters clanging closed, students laughing in groups. Above ground, the city thrives, vibrant and unburdened. But beneath your feet, in chambers of concrete and steel, echoes linger. The scrape of shovels, the breath of children in the dark, the whispered prayers of civilians awaiting fire from the skies. And you know this truth. The bunkers are not gone. They wait, silent, invisible, shaping the earth beneath modern lives. They are not just relics of war. They are reminders of how fragile memory can be, how easily history is buried, and how deeply it continues to shape us, even when unseen.
You follow the narrow alleyways of modern Japan, the neon glow of convenience stores reflecting off wet asphalt. And yet, your mind sinks back underground. The bunkers you've been exploring are no longer only relics of war. They have become sites of rediscovery, of preservation, and, sometimes, of quiet obsession. You imagine a group of historians, their boots crunching on gravel, flashlights in hand, notebooks ready, cameras clicking. They are here not to plunder, but to record, to understand, to make sure that these silent stone chambers, these concrete memories, do not vanish completely under the weight of development. The movement to rediscover these spaces is surprisingly recent. In the 1970s and 1980s, urban expansion and economic boom led to the erasure of countless bunkers. Apartments rose where command tunnels once spread like veins. Roads were paved over hidden shelters. But as the first generation of post-war Japanese historians began reflecting on the war with a new perspective, a quiet underground archaeology emerged. They began documenting what remained, speaking to survivors who remembered hiding in basements and occasionally uncovering entrances that had been sealed for decades. One mainstream historical fact: in 1993, a team in Yokohama discovered an extensive network of bunkers beneath a factory slated for demolition. The tunnels were so well built that they had survived without collapse despite being buried under nearly 50 years of soil and urban development. Inside, crates of wartime equipment remained largely intact: rusted rifles, maps, and ration tins stacked meticulously. It was a vivid reminder that these tunnels were not makeshift. They were engineered to endure, even in secrecy. And yet, rediscovery is rarely straightforward. Local residents sometimes resist, fearing safety hazards or potential legal complications. Excavations require permits, engineers, and careful reinforcement. Many tunnels are partially collapsed or waterlogged. The work is painstaking, slow, and often underfunded. You imagine volunteers in raincoats crawling through mud, measuring walls with laser tools, photographing peeling calligraphy on concrete, a labor of devotion to ghosts of a forgotten past.
Quirky discoveries pepper the records. A historian in Kobe uncovered a bunker with what appeared to be a small underground shrine, complete with faded statues and offerings. The shrine had been maintained secretly throughout the war, possibly as a morale booster or as a ritual of protection. In another case, a school basement yielded hundreds of paper dolls, carefully arranged on shelves. Were they left by children to comfort themselves, or perhaps by older students to honor classmates? Historians still argue whether these artifacts were personal mementos or intentional messages left behind for those who might return. the preservation efforts are not limited to artifacts alone. Some tunnels have been turned into museums, their narrow corridors retrofitted with lighting, signage, and audio guides. In Tokyo, one bunker near a subway station has been open to the public, offering visitors a visceral experience of wartime anxiety. You descend the stairs, hearing the faint hum of ventilation fans, and the walls seem to close in just as they would have for civilians 75 years ago. Ambient sounds play softly, distant air raid sirens, the murmur of people, the echo of footsteps. It is almost like stepping into a time capsule designed for empathy rather than history lessons. Even more modern techniques have been brought to bear. Archaeologists now employ ground-penetrating radar, 3D scanning, and digital modeling to map tunnels without disturbing them physically. You picture a team of researchers, laptops open, monitoring data as virtual renderings of labyrinthine bunkers emerge in real time. Each measurement, each contour captured, adds to a digital archive of spaces that may someday be completely inaccessible. There is a tension here between memory and modernity. On one hand, the bunkers are physical testaments to resilience, ingenuity, and, at times, desperation. On the other, they are dangerous and decaying, posing real threats to those who enter without care. Preservationists must balance curiosity and caution, documenting history while respecting both legal and safety constraints. And while museums make these spaces accessible, they inevitably sanitize them. You cannot fully convey the stench of damp stone, the palpable fear of air raids, or the claustrophobic darkness that pressed on families who hid inside.
This leads to an interesting scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary value of preservation should be educational, cultural, or commemorative. Should bunkers be left as solemn reminders of wartime suffering, restored for historical tourism, or maintained as sacred spaces honoring those who endured? There is no consensus, and each new discovery rekindles the question. Quirks and oddities continue to surface. In one preserved bunker near Nagoya, researchers discovered a series of tunnels leading to what seemed like a small living quarters, complete with paper scrolls bearing carefully practiced calligraphy and a tiny stove for cooking. The layout suggested that someone had intended to remain underground for months, perhaps indefinitely. Imagine the psychological strain of knowing the world above was ablaze while you exist in total darkness, subsisting on canned food and whispered hope. And while most visitors come for historical curiosity, some arrive with treasure maps in hand, inspired by rumors of gold, imperial artifacts, or military secrets. You almost chuckle imagining hobbyists crawling through mud, flashlights in hand, muttering about hidden trains of gold. Yet in doing so, they bring public attention to spaces that might otherwise remain ignored. Even fringe pursuits inadvertently aid preservation. The modern lens adds another layer. Urban development often collides with memory. New construction, roadworks, and subway expansions unearth previously unknown tunnels, prompting emergency archaeological interventions. Sometimes artifacts are removed, tunnels reinforced, and entrances sealed once again. Sometimes they are converted into historical sites. The city grows, the past persists, and you, as a visitor in thought, are caught between the two, walking over streets that conceal entire histories, hearing echoes of footsteps that belong to another era. As you stand at the entrance of a restored bunker, feeling the cool air brush your face, you realize that the underground world you have been tracing is not static. It continues to evolve, not in the construction of new walls, but in how people perceive it. Some see opportunity, some see danger, some see history. All of it is true. The bunkers serve as a lens for reflecting on the past while navigating the present. You take a final glance at the narrow concrete passageways, the sealed doors, and the faint inscriptions left by those who once occupied the space. Each mark, each crack, each artifact preserved in glass or photograph speaks of survival, fear, ingenuity, and ultimately the resilience of memory itself. You step back into the sunlit street above, the city's hum resuming around you.
carrying the weight of these subterranean stories tucked underfoot. The bunkers remain, quiet witnesses to time, waiting for the next curious soul to peer into the darkness and listen.
You wander through the outskirts of a sleepy Japanese town, the evening air carrying a faint scent of damp earth and pine, and yet your mind plunges underground once again. Somewhere beneath your feet, or perhaps just a few streets away, lie bunkers whose very existence is a cocktail of history and legend. This is the realm of whispered rumors, the domain where truth and myth entwine so tightly that separating them feels almost sacrilegious. The first thing you notice is how pervasive these tales are. Locals speak of gold trains, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers, as if the wrong listener might summon disaster. They say that in the waning months of the war, imperial treasures, gold, jewelry, scrolls, and ceremonial armor were spirited away into tunnels no soldier or civilian would ever return from. Some tunnels supposedly led from central Tokyo all the way to the outskirts, designed with secret exits that emerged miles away in forests or hidden coastal areas. You lean against a lamppost and imagine the elaborate precision required to hide vast caches beneath a city teeming with chaos, fire, and air raids. Legendary gold trains. The legend of Yamashita's gold is often invoked, though strictly speaking it concerns the Philippines. Nevertheless, Japanese bunkers are said to hold fragments of the story. Trains or convoys carrying gold and other riches hidden inside reinforced tunnels designed to survive bombings, earthquakes, and time itself. You imagine explorers descending into darkness with metal detectors, lanterns swaying, flashlights slicing through black, dreaming of treasure that may or may not exist. Yet historians remain skeptical. Scholars still argue whether the treasures actually existed or if these myths were exaggerated to maintain hope in the waning months of the war. After all, Japan was in chaos. Administrative breakdowns, collapsed supply chains, and rampant destruction. Could organized treasure caches realistically have survived? The debate continues, fueled by decades of anecdotal accounts, cryptic maps, and the occasional tantalizing discovery of small, valuable items. The intersection of fact and folklore. Walking past a bamboo grove, you notice a small, crumbling concrete hatch hidden under leaves. A local elderly man claims it once led to a hidden treasury sealed by an officer who disappeared during the final weeks of the war. He insists the hatch has never been opened. You smile politely. This could be folklore, could be wishful thinking, but it also might be truth lost to time. French stories abound. Some claim that secret bunkers beneath major cities contain not just gold but advanced technology, including experimental radios and code-breaking machines. Others tell of rooms stocked with luxury items, silk kimonos, and crates of rare tea intended for high-ranking officers or perhaps for the emperor himself. You pause and picture someone in 1945 meticulously storing priceless tea leaves in a damp concrete chamber while the world above crumbled in flames. It seems absurd, yet the human impulse to preserve some semblance of normalcy or luxury during catastrophe is unmistakable. Rediscovery efforts spark fascination. These myths fuel not only casual speculation, but also archaeological investigation. Teams of historians, students, and treasure hunters have scoured old maps, wartime diaries, and municipal records, attempting to locate hidden rooms or sealed doors. Some discoveries have been mundane, rooms filled with old furniture, ration tins, or forgotten documents. Others are more intriguing, small caches of coins, ceremonial swords, or porcelain figurines. Each find adds credibility to the idea that more might be hidden, waiting silently beneath the urban sprawl. You move through a narrow alley, imagining treasure hunters crawling through mud, flashlights glinting off rusted metal. They sometimes set up cameras, sensors, and scanners, hoping to detect voids or metallic objects beneath the concrete. Occasionally, construction crews stumble upon hidden doors while digging for new buildings, sparking flurries of media coverage. Yet most discoveries end quickly. Legal restrictions prevent the removal of artifacts without permits, and safety concerns seal tunnels once more. The treasure, real or imagined, remains largely elusive. Symbolism beyond wealth. But perhaps the allure of hidden treasure is less about gold and more about connection. Connection to a time, a society, a collective memory. These bunkers, after all, were spaces of desperation, survival, and secrecy. Imagining a gold-filled room adds layers of narrative. Who protected it? Why it was hidden? And what was lost in the process? The treasure becomes symbolic, a metaphor for the intangible riches of memory and history. Walking past a shuttered convenience store, you consider another layer of legend, the bunkers as sites of espionage. Some tunnels are said to have contained secret communication equipment, dead drops for intelligence, and hidden rooms for planning military maneuvers. In this sense, the treasure is not just monetary, it's informational, a glimpse into strategies, decisions, and lives lost in secrecy. Historians still argue whether some of these tunnels were actively used for espionage or if the tales emerged from post-war imaginations seeking drama in hidden spaces. Visiting the sites today, a few bunkers have been preserved with guided tours emphasizing these legends. Signs caution visitors, enter at your own risk, treasure rumored but unverified. You descend a reinforced staircase into one of these tunnels. The air is cooler than above ground, and you hear the faint drip of condensation. Flashing your light across the walls, you imagine children hiding during air raids, officers whispering in corners, perhaps even someone hiding a small crate of gold or a ceremonial sword, never to be seen again. It is impossible to know which stories are true, which are exaggerated, and which serve as cultural memory. The myths themselves, however, hold value. They generate curiosity, preserve interest in history, and occasionally spur discoveries. They are a reminder that the past is never truly silent. It whispers through rumor, folklore, and speculation, inviting each new generation to explore, question, and imagine. You stand at the tunnel entrance, breathing deeply. The sun above begins to set, painting the streets in shades of orange and gold. The bunker below remains, a vault of silence, legend, and memory. You step back into the modern hum of the city, knowing that beneath your feet, somewhere in the dark, secrets await. Some will never be found, and perhaps that is the point. The past is partly tangible, partly mysterious, and always quietly alive. You step away from the ivy-choked entrance, the city alive around you, neon flickering on wet streets, the chatter of evening commuters drifting in from the surface, and yet beneath your feet the world you've been tracing continues in secret. Concrete chambers, narrow tunnels, and hidden alcoves that have survived decades of urban expansion, earthquakes, and forgetfulness. These bunkers are not just relics, they are living echoes of human experience pressing silently against the modern world. You wander past an ordinary suburban street, the hum of a passing train overhead. Children's laughter drifts from a nearby playground, bicycles clatter across pavement, and the smell of grilled street food drifts on the breeze. And yet, beneath it all, the earth shelters memory, footsteps of families who huddled in terror, officers plotting in dimly lit rooms, whispers of gold or secrets that may never be found. The contrast is jarring. Life continues, vibrant and seemingly unaware of the subterranean history beneath. Modern reflections. Visiting these bunkers today is more than historical curiosity. It is a meditation on resilience, secrecy, and human adaptability. You imagine what it must have been like to descend into one of these spaces during the worst nights of the war, unsure if the world above would survive until morning. Each drip of water, each rough stone wall carries a weight of stories. Children clutching their mothers, elders whispering prayers, soldiers pacing while plotting defensive strategies, and civilians enduring long, suffocating nights. These are the intangible riches the bunkers preserve, the human echoes that remain long after bombs have fallen and steel is rusted. Some tunnels have been repurposed as museums or cultural sites, where visitors can feel the chill of underground stone, hear recreated air raid sirens, and step into immersive experiences that hint at fear, endurance, and survival. Others remain sealed, overgrown, or entirely forgotten. In either case, the presence of these spaces influences the collective imagination, reminding Japan and indeed the world that history does not vanish simply because it is buried. You pause at an overgrown entrance, brushing your fingers across the rough concrete. Perhaps a family once huddled here, listening to the distant roar of B-29 bombers. Perhaps an officer hid maps and plans for battles that never came. Perhaps, in some corners, faint traces of treasure, or merely the echo of imagined treasure, remain. Historians still argue whether all these stories can be verified, but their resonance is undeniable. The bunkers embody both fact and myth, reality and legend.
The haunting presence. Even today, walking near these sites evokes unease. The earth seems heavier, the air cooler, the shadows longer. You might hear a soft drip, a scuff, or a whisper of air forced through a vent, and for a moment, it feels as though history itself is exhaling. The bunkers are not just structures, they are vessels of memory, pressing against the surface, waiting for recognition. They are subtle reminders that the past does not simply disappear, it persists in hidden layers, beneath the streets, beneath homes, beneath the daily rhythm of life. You recall the civilians who once crawled through these tunnels, the soldiers who labored tirelessly to fortify them, and the myriad rumors of treasure that colored human imagination. These spaces remind us that human experience is complex, layered, and often contradictory. Fear and hope, despair and endurance, secrecy and revelation, coexisting in confined stone chambers. Looking forward. As modern Japan continues to expand and modernize, these bunkers occupy a strange in-between, neither entirely part of history nor fully erased from memory. Preservationists and archaeologists work to document them. Enthusiasts explore them. Local governments sometimes seal them for safety, yet the earth itself keeps them alive. They remind us that beneath the visible city, history breathes quietly, patiently, often unnoticed. You take a final look at an entrance hidden behind a low fence and a tangle of weeds. It is ordinary, almost unremarkable, yet beneath lies extraordinary human history. Perhaps you will return, perhaps you will leave it undisturbed, but the impression lingers. The past is buried, yes, but never gone. And as you step fully into sunlight, the bustle of the streets, the neon, the smell of food, the laughter of children, these all carry the weight of what lies beneath, silent yet persistent, hidden yet unforgettable.
The city hums around you, a vibrant overlay to the silent histories beneath. You slow your pace, feeling the soft warmth of evening air against your skin, and allow the tension of the underground world to gently release. The concrete chambers, the narrow tunnels, the hidden alcoves, they exist quietly, unseen by most but never absent. They are the footprints of fear and endurance, of families pressed together in dark spaces, of soldiers pacing and planning, of whispered prayers that have faded into memory, yet remain alive beneath the surface. You imagine the air inside, heavy, damp, filled with the scent of stone and earth, carrying the echoes of footsteps, whispers, and children's frightened murmurs. You remember the legends of treasure, the gold, the ceremonial swords, the carefully stored tea, and you realize that these are more than objects. They are symbols of human hope and imagination, of what we choose to remember and what we bury. Above ground, life continues, seemingly unaware of the layers beneath.
Yet, even as traffic hums, children laugh, and lights flicker, the bunkers persist, pressing history gently into the present. They remind us that memory is resilient, that survival leaves traces, and that the past is never fully gone, even when buried. You breathe deeply, letting the ambient sounds of modern life blend with imagined whispers of the past. The world feels larger, deeper, and infinitely layered. And as the evening settles, as light softens into shadow, you carry a quiet reverence for these hidden chambers, silent witnesses to resilience, secrecy, and the unyielding persistence of human experience. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let yourself drift, carrying the weight and wonder of hidden history into a calm, reflective sleep.